Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. So today we have the Econ Show, and on the Econ Show, we're going to break it up into our five different segments. And in the first segment, we really want to go into how food prices have started to turn back higher, which is what we were talking about. But there's a lot of momentum behind that increase. So you're going to get a lot of momentum based on rice pricing, based on what is happening out of Russia, Ukraine, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then when you start looking at the other issues that continue to happen within the region, and a lot of that is around manufacturing. We want to look at the manufacturing side because the inflation is going to continue to be pushed up based on grain prices, based on food prices. And we want to look at, well, who's the most impacted? But then, well, if the consumer is going to get hit, what is going to happen to the economy, globally speaking, as well, as the manufacturing side continues to remain sluggish. Then we're going to, in segment 2, we're going to talk about how inflation matched expectations, and then what do we see happening so far in August, and how is that going to set us up going into the Fed meeting in September. Then we want to look at a consumer update. We got some consumer credit expanded. It was on the non-revolving, the revolving credit, the credit card side went down a bit. And now the question is, is this the beginning of some of that consumer slowdown? Is this the beginning of some of that pressure? And then we want to look at housing and real estate, and again, tie that back to where things are when you start looking at the inflation side. Then we're going to talk about Europe. European data slips further into contraction. It just continues to confirm what we've been talking about when we look at a lot of those pressure points on a recessionary basis there. And then we want to look at China and some of the Chinese data that came out. One of the big pieces that we've been talking about is the broad slowdown on trade, on exports, and that really came to fruition here with a sizable write-down, or I should say readjustment of flows when we look back through March and forward in terms of how some of that has been reduced, and again, maximizing or seeing that pressure increase at the Chinese level. So now when we turn to segment 1, you can see that the UN Food and Agriculture World Food Price Index has pivoted back up. And for those that have been watching us, we've been saying that if you just looked at future contracts, and if you looked at the cost that has been just building throughout the supply chain, it was going to make sense, or it was very likely to see food prices actually start to turn back up. Now, unfortunately, we don't think it stops. We think that we are going to continue to see this path higher as we have future prices that remain expensive and continuing to show expense. And then when you look at rice, which we're going to talk about in a minute, back to 2008 highs. And unfortunately, over 3 billion people rely on rice as a main staple. And that is only going to then pull that UN food component higher, just because rice is a big piece of it. Grains and cereals are a big piece of it, as well as oils, and all of that is moving up. And just to give you an idea of who's going to be impacted by this, the weight of food in the CPI basket, obviously you have Nigeria, India, but you get an idea of just the level of growth and how this is really going to reaccelerate the pressure when you start looking at inflation, especially in some of these countries which are already struggling, or at least some of them are, in terms of industrial production, economic growth. And this is just going to be another headwind. And just given based on where inflation is around the world, it's also going to hinder, well, how quickly can we see rates get moved lower? How quickly can we really see monetary policy get looser when you look at a reacceleration of gasoline prices, diesel prices, food prices, and realistically, we've had so much money just poured into the system. It's going to take time to see that come out. Now, just looking at back to what we were talking about in terms of 2008, when you look at rice in Asia, you're at levels that we haven't seen since 2008. Taking out the highs that we saw between 2010 and 2011. And a lot of that, it comes to Thailand urging farmers to curb planting because of water issues. We already have India banning the export of non-basmati rice. And now that's one side. Then you have the other issues that we've seen in terms of excessive rainfall, especially in China. So heavy rain hit China's northeast area, hurting crops in some areas of the country's grain basket, threatening to increase imports at a time of rising food insecurity. Recent flooding has destroyed rice planted in parts of Jilin and Heilongjiang provinces. The rains are expected to continue across most of the region this week as typhoon season continues to wreak havoc. The northeastern region, which also includes the province of Liang and Inner Mongolia, produce almost 30% of China's grain, accounting for 45% of the national corn harvest, 60% of soybeans, and 20% of rice. Farmers have already been forced to contend with heat waves over the summer, and the latest evidence that climate change, or at least this extreme weather, continues to hurt these markets. Now, China has been a big buyer. They've been really trying to increase storage. But again, this is just impacting what we've been talking about, which is their local consumption, their local ability to feed themselves, which is going to put more reliance on and realistically more stress on that international system. Especially when you look at global rice market balance, as we've been saying, we already were bearish rice. And for those that have been following us, we've been saying that rice was already seeing stress. That came to fruition when you had that deficit that showed up. We made that call in 2020. Just based on what we were seeing, it came to fruition in that 21 to 22 harvest, and it's only continued to get worse. And as you can see, it's not that we don't see much improvement. Major rice exporters, just to give you an idea of why we talk so much about India, Vietnam, Thailand, you get an idea of why they're so important, because they're the top three. I mean, you're looking at the top three exporters. Vietnam so far is fine. They haven't put any restrictions on it. They've actually been benefiting, obviously, from this. But you get an idea of the issues that continue to reside within the industry, within the market, because you're looking at a staple for over 3 billion people. And again, more of that tailwind for that inflationary pressure. Now, when we start looking at, again, some of the shifts, when you look at manufacturing employment in the U.S., you're seeing more of this coming back. Because remember, we've talked about nearshoring, onshoring. States in the West and the South have seen the largest gains in manufacturing jobs. And we continue to see that moving into the U.S., but it's leaving somewhere. And one of the things that I had talked about when I did my dissertation back in 2006 was that globalization was going to come full circle by 2016, and you were going to start to see that adjust more aggressively between 16, but again, nothing happens quickly between 2016, 2018, and then from 2018 on, you were going to see that accelerate. I was right that we did see some change in manufacturing in terms of textiles, but it took more time to see this really start to pick up, and you did start to see it pick up. But obviously, I was aided by by COVID and just highlighting just how insecure the supply chains were as we went to at-time deliveries, limited to the amount of inventory, and now this is going to be a big hit when you start looking at, well, a lot of these nations, especially China, rely significantly on the manufacturing side, and a lot of that, they are the number one country that companies are leaving, and that is going to put more stress on them as well. Global manufacturing output remained steepened in a downturn in July as at the latest PMI data indicated a faster drop in new orders linked to a deeper slide in global trade and continued inventory reduction policies. So again, what we're seeing is what we've been highlighting. As we say, follow the boats. The boats are going to tell you where things are, and we've been looking at it. Maastricht came out and took their expectations down. We're just seeing this slowdown, and as we said, it starts at developed markets. It starts at the top and then trickles down, and now we're finally starting to see the bigger hit to the emerging markets at the worst time when you consider inflation and other types of problems. New export orders for manufactured goods fell at the quickest rate recorded so far this year. So again, the worst rate for 2023. The monthly decline was also the 17th in a row, representing the worst prolonged period of downturn since the global financial crisis. So again, 17th in a row, that's over a year. So we're looking at almost a year and a half of perpetual reductions in new export orders. And again, that's the leading indicator, which just means that August is going to be just as weak as July or weaker than July. And we're moving in the wrong direction, especially when you consider that typically you do get an increase in some trade, especially because it's been so low for so long that you still have back to school. You still have the end of the summer vacation. You still have the ordering that picks up for Christmas and for the holiday season, and we're just not seeing that, and that's what we continue to highlight as an underlying problem. A spell of falling inflows of new orders means that producers have greatly relied on back orders to sustain production levels, resulting in falling backlogs, particularly as global supply chains have begun to improve. Because again, that bullwhip that we've talked about, where you overorder and then then you have this big surge, and then you have a significant amount sitting in inventory. And now the backlog, which was created by this bullwhip, is completely gone. So, or at least 95% gone. So now you have this issue in terms of, well, what are the backlogs going to do? What are manufacturers going to use to maintain their current run rates? Because realistically, you just don't need it, especially as these new orders have diminished and your backlog is now essentially just completely caught up. Adding to the manufacturing malaise is a sustained trend of inventory reduction at producers amid weak demand and cost-cutting measures, with July signaling the fastest drop in input buying since January. So again, you're looking at that acceleration to the downside. It's now, and we'll talk about this in segments 2 and 3. We continue to have a bit of a buildup in inventories in the U.S. on the wholesale side, the retail side. Even if some of it has come down a bit, it's just we're not seeing a meaningful change and increase in some of this capacity, which again is just going to keep those orders very slow. Of the 31 economies around the world where manufacturing PMI data is available for July, only 10 reported higher output, led by a sharp expansion in India, which we've talked about. That will pare back a bit, still stay strong, but will pare back just a bit. And that's why we led with that inflation side and how India is technically the second most impacted by food inflation in the world, which is going to hurt a bit harder. 7 of the 8 worst ranking economies were found in Europe. Again, back to what we've been saying about Europe for anybody that's been following or watched the Europe show, is that we do believe that they are already in a worsening recession. Now, one of the other things that we've talked about is that the manufacturing service weakness, especially the manufacturing weakness, is going to flatline. You're going to get to a point where it's not going to get much worse, but we don't see it getting much better either. And it's going to adjust, where some places might get a bit better, some places will get a bit worse. And you're going to get this balancing act, which is going to keep us in a downtrend in a recession or a recessionary standpoint, but not this huge collapse. And that's why we've talked about this pain point that's going to carry from 2023 into 2024. And we don't see that big shift. Then when you look at the G7 and you look at, headline inflation has come down on a year-over-year level. Comps are ridiculously hard. So it makes sense to come down, but core is not coming down the same way. And we'll talk more about this in the US and some of the other regions, how there's stickiness there. When you look at services, when you look at the increase in wages, when you look at some of the sticky components, and now you actually have a sizable change in the flexible side, which again is going to bridge some of that and create additional pressure when we look down in terms of what's to come. Then when we look at tightening financial conditions, they've loosened in some places, but you can still see generally speaking, they're still tighter. It's just they're not as tight as they were. And this is going to be a concern when you look at where inflation is going. You're having a bit of a reacceleration in inflation. And realistically, we should have seen a much bigger decline on a month-over-month basis. And remember, month-over-month is cumulative. So you're looking at, yes, the rate of change has come down, but prices are still going up month on month. And that is increasing pain for the consumer. And it's going to be difficult to see a bigger change in both fiscal and monetary policy with this backdrop. mainstream emerging markets, worsening productivity and potential GDP growth. As we've been saying, it's just you continue to see productivity growth coming down, working age population becoming a bit weaker, which is another reason why you're seeing some of these pivots, because the wage, or I should say the labor disconnect continues to be a problem. The labor disconnect is real, and the benefit of moving to Asia, the benefit of moving production to Asia and other places is diminishing. Some, not all places. Vietnam, it's still positive. Indonesia, India, Pakistan, but not China. And that's where you're starting to see some of that bigger pivot. But as you get these movements and the shift in productivity and manufacturing with this backdrop of accelerating inflation, you're going to pull down that underlying GDP growth and create that pressure. And here's just another look at signs of further worsening exports. You're starting to see some of that slowdown in terms of pricing, in terms of the index. Now, it has stabilized, but you're getting an idea that things have come down to the point where we've caught up and there's not a whole lot of new capacity coming on because we don't have the demand. Now, when we start looking at emerging markets and the China versus U.S. question, exporting more to China is still Korea, Taiwan, Brazil, Peru, Chile. But it's interesting because it's a percentage to total. So it's a percentage to total volume. But when you start looking at some of these different levels, you're getting a bit of a mix. And that's why it's interesting, because you're still exporting to the U.S. The U.S. is still a big driver behind it. And Taiwan, Korea are still a very important piece to China in general. And that's why when you start looking at the back and forth with, it just happened recently, I think it was 8 ships and several aircraft were moved into Taiwan's EEZ zone, or defense zone. But they're still a huge part of China's import-export side. So they can say a lot of things, they can saber rattle, but are you really going to see a much bigger impact in general? Then when you look at Russia and Ukraine and the different impacts, yesterday it was I shouldn't say funny, but it was interesting to see that China, that we did see some of these interesting pivots, because wheat went down because there were no new attacks, and crude went up because there was the attack on one of the tankers that was moving crude and products from Russia into Syria. So it's like, okay, so you can attack one, but the other's okay? It's like, no, it's like there's going to be a broad attacks across all commodities, which is why we do think that wheat is still, and grains in general, still have a lot of upside, because we don't see a new Black Sea deal. Turkey just had a big explosion in one of their core storage areas for grains. And you're seeing that pressure that is just going to continue to mount, and why we see inflation remaining sticky, that stagflation that we've been talking about, it continues to be there because of the commodity supply issue. So even as demand comes down, it's just there's not new supply, which is keeping those prices elevated. So that's what we have for you on the global front. In the next segment, we're going to go deeper into the U.S. and the most recent inflation data and how that's interacting with what's happening in the bond world.